Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Yes, you guessed it right. It's COVID-19 talk again. We've been discussing the impact on economies, job losses, changes in lifestyles, a new understanding of what security means. But there are other aspects and paradoxes. Take, for example, the use of digital technology to track and surveil infected people and who all they might have met after being infected. This tracking is important. It gives us the clusters that the health system can deal with. A good thing, no? Yes, while the scourge rages. No, post-COVID-19. The technology will stay long after the virus is gone. It increases the capacity of states to track people. Tracking gives information. Information is power. Power empowers the state against society. Take China. This is what Eshmoglu and Robinson would call a despotic leviathan. Technology makes it efficient. It can control information, it can use information. Result, near omnipotent control of people. Then there's history with its inflection points. What does this scourge mean for us? Is the era of liberal democracies, individual liberties, and strong societies over? Questions abound. But let's dive into it. We are joined today by Dr. Ilhan Niaz, who is Associate Professor of History. We also have with us Professor Chee Khoon, who is an expert in social policy and is a professor of health and social policy, joins us from Kuala Lumpur. Thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Professor Chee Khoon. Professor, there is the issue of digital technology being used, but as I said in my opening, it has its pluses and it has its minuses. What is your reading of the situation?
Yes, I share your concerns, and to be honest, I'm quite ambivalent about it myself. If you look at the experiences of the East Asian countries, which thus far seem to have managed somewhat better in terms of suppressing the COVID outbreak, China to begin with, and the so-called tiger economies, we used to refer to them, okay, a decade or two ago. Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and to an extent Japan. Now these countries differed in the outbreak responses that they resorted to in the case. But even within a country, in China, you had the lockdown, very stringent lockdown in Wuhan and other parts of Hubei. But in other parts of China, there were less stringent, what you might call lockdown-like. So the Chinese approach to it was fairly calibrated, and it was a very, very fluid, quite dynamic, depending on the situation as
Professor,
it developed.
let me interject here.
Right.
We have seen that Chinese way of dealing with it is frankly not replicable in other parts of the world. Like we saw 13 cities and 60 million people locked down. Now, no other state has that kind of capacity and enforcement procedures to do that. But what Chinese also did, and this is a very interesting report, which talks about China fighting COVID-19 with automated tyranny. And most of this comes from Chinese bloggers. Now, there's something they were using called the health code. And this is a code that actually allows the state to track everyone. Now, my question, regardless of how various countries are dealing with it, has to do with the fact that this big data, the algorithm, or what Cathy O'Neill calls the weapons of math destruction, these are important in fighting this, but they're also tools that allow states to become way more powerful than societies. So that's a concern that needs to be addressed.
Right. Actually, I was getting to that. I was going to contrast the situations in the other East Asian countries, the so-called four tiger ex-tigers. Okay? They didn't resort to the kind of lockdown, okay? Wuhan style or Italy style lockdown. Okay? In Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and South Korea, okay, there wasn't that kind of massive lockdown. Not even well, maybe lockdown light. Okay? And they allowed that was not so much of a, did not restrict. The impact, okay, on the economy was perhaps somewhat lighter. Okay? But what was in common among all the countries, China and the others, again, was resort to this IT technologies. Again. Now, in the case, and there's a spectrum of it. Again. In the case of China, it at one extreme, you think of the face recognition technologies, but in the other countries, like the other four countries, again, there was resort to mobile locational apps, okay, which allowed those countries, okay, to carry out contact tracing, and in some certain instances, monitoring of compliance, okay, with quarantine, for example. Now, to take my own country, Malaysia. Malaysia shares a lot of similarities with Singapore. In fact, we used to be part of the same country. But what Singapore did, okay, the measures that resulted in the NPI measures resulted to, without, for instance, closure of schools, or there's still a significant allowance for movement of citizens around here. This was something that Malaysia couldn't quite adopt again, because one very significant difference between Malaysia, okay, and Singapore. Both of us have a very high proportion of migrant labor. In the case of Singapore, okay, the proportion of the labor force actually approaches a Gulf state levels. Okay. Malaysia is not quite as much, but roughly 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 of our employed workforce is either a documented or an undocumented migrant worker. In the case of Singapore, Singapore is a very well policed state. Okay? So it's almost impossible to remain undetected for long as an undocumented
Absolutely,
migrant worker.
it's also, Professor, a city-state. I mean, its population is a little more than 5 million. The city in which I live, just one city in Punjab, Pakistan, Lahore, is more than 11 million. So the models are completely different, and I completely agree with you that Singapore is a city-state. It's highly educated, very disciplined, and it also, in a way, is you can police everyone.
It has the governance characteristics and the institutional capacity to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's not the case in Malaysia. Again, in Malaysia, we have this situation again of a very large population of undocumented migrants. Okay, for instance, in metropolitan Kuala Lumpur, there's easily 1 million out of a population of 3-4 million. Easily 1 million undocumented migrant workers, and because of the way undocumented migrants have been treated by various
absolutely.
agencies.
That's the entire paradox, that on the one hand, the state needs the information. On the other hand, when it has the information, it can use that information to the detriment of the society. But thank you so much. That was Professor Chee Khoon speaking with us. Let me go to Dr. Ilhan Niaz. Ilhan, I talked about the inflection points in history. I mean, how do you look at this? There was, okay, let me put it like this. So Black Death was a black swan event, and to a large extent, so was the Spanish influenza. But this has been talked about for a fairly long time, since 2007, 2008, and experts have been talking about it. They've been warning about such pandemics, and this particular virus. Its family has been around for a while, and yet no one was really prepared. Now, we are in the middle of it. Do you think this is going to have some kind of impact in terms of it being an inflection point?
Well, first of all, I don't really subscribe to the notion that you do have black swan events. The recurrence of epidemics, pandemics in human history is so well documented and goes so far back. that the evolution of diseases alongside the evolution of large numbers of people has gone hand in hand, ever since we settled down and started living in large crowds. So it's a bit more of a pink flamingo in the sense that it's really obviously going to happen, but people only realize that it's there when it actually strikes them in the face. So in that sense, there's one element over there. The other thing, of course, is that these events do take place, but they typically take place with sufficient gap that human beings basically forget about what's happened earlier and are therefore caught by surprise or caught less prepared than they actually should be. And then all of a sudden, of course, when it strikes and business as usual cannot continue, then you have a lot of focus upon people who perhaps had been making these predictions, scientists, thinkers, etc., who had been warning that something like this is going to happen. But this is something that unfortunately we find again and again. So, I mean, you referenced the flu pandemic in 1918. And that had a devastating impact on the United States, for instance. Something like 500,000 people, maybe more, died in that pandemic. But after that, the United States turned to its most intensely capitalistic, selfish decade, the Roaring '20s, which then crashed into the Great Depression. And even then, it took basically the Second World War to move the American political consensus in favor of certain basic welfare, civil rights, and other such policies, which were enacted between 1933 and 1972 or thereabouts. But after that, once the memory faded of those traumas, you have a return to hardcore capitalism, free market fundamentalism, Milton Friedman, etc. And the world seems to forget about all the disasters that it has recently faced. So I suspect this is what's going to happen with COVID-19 as well.
That's a very interesting insight, Ilhan. I think I would agree with you that memories are very short, and also the people who are at the cutting edge of things, and in this case, the scientists and others who deal with these issues, always ahead of their time, and the rest of the majority does not, very often does not heed their warnings. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Ilhan Niaz speaking with us. I'm also joined by Pierluigi Paganini, who is an analyst, the founder of Security Affairs and Sybase SPA, joins me from Rome. Mr. Paganini, thank you for being on the program. Quickly, we were talking about the fact that digital technology is being used for tracking and surveilling infected people, which, under the circumstances, seems perfectly fine, but it also gives those tools to states post-COVID-19, post this pandemic, which will allow some of the states to actually control societies. So are we looking at a period in which individual liberties and liberal democracies are going to face a challenge?
Okay, first of all, thank you. Well, let me say that we all know that technologies are becoming essential in the fight against the coronavirus outbreak. And this is true on a global scale, especially in the healthcare industries. Using technologies, we can analyze the diffusion of the virus, tracking the movements of the affected individuals. We can attempt to find the origin of the outbreaks. We can make simulation in the laboratories to evaluate the efficiencies of the medicines to fight infections. And we also can perform rapidly some tests on patients. But we cannot ignore that these technologies could be abused by government and threat actors. They pose a dangerous risk for the security and privacy of the individuals. Let's think of a mobile application that could be used by government to track individuals and analyze the diffusion of the virus. Clearly, this scenario could open the door to surveillance activities that are operated by governments and also in the post-coronavirus emergency. social networks, instant messaging applications.
So you agree that that is a danger?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, I have something. Let me read out for you. I'm sure you are aware of this. This is about the Chinese use of a particular health code. And this is an app, and its color determination has a wide-ranging impact on the life of at least 700 million users. And local authorities throughout China require people to show their app when they hail a ride, go to supermarkets, or enter and exit residential areas and the subway. Their ability to move around, earn a living, and even obtain necessities and medical care are dependent on the app's tricolor code. Now, this is almost like science fiction.
Basically, we can use any kind of data that is acquired by this kind of application to perform surveillance. Remember, the mobile phone is always with us. In the mobile phone, we store our private information. The mobile phone makes our same moments. So in every instance, I'm able to localize the people. I'm able to understand which is the interest of people. For example, seeing which is the browsing histories. I'm also able to construct its a network, or it's a social network, to understand which is the people that socialize with this person. I'm also able to track any habits of individuals. I'm also able to understand when this guy go to work, when go to gym, when speak with other people of interest. Clearly, this mass collection of information could be used also for surveillance activities. I'm very scared of the use of this data in specific situations, in specific countries where oppositions are tracked using this kind of technologies. Now,
we're basically in a situation where obviously this is not something that can be disinvented. This is something that all of us use. It has a number of conveniences, but there is the subterranean danger that lurks underneath this, and that allows states to actually control societies and populations by being able to, because information is power, and they will hold all the information, and that gives them power.
You're right. Information is power, and who controls the information is controlling the world. So it's essential for any government, for any company, to acquire the largest number of information of individuals. Acquiring this information, you can use them for different purposes. You can also influence the sentiment of people against specific topics. So you can control this person. But you have also to consider another aspect. If you apply a mass surveillance in countries, you are also exposing the people of these countries to the risk that also foreign rogue states could target the surveillance networks and use it also for its purposes. So there are two risks. The first risk is connected to mass surveillance, so the privacy of the individuals is at risk. But another aspect is the surveillance activities that is hacked by third parties and used to collect information on the state itself.
Absolutely. But here's the thing, Paganini. States are aware of and they are concerned about the second part of it, about an adversary gathering information about a state. And obviously, as you know, the US and Israel and various other states that are at the cutting edge of digital technology and cyber war are putting a lot of money into that. But I'm here more concerned about the first one, the sort of, the state's ability to actually reduce the space for individual liberties.
The risk is concrete. I totally agree with you. And the use or the abuse of this application fit this urgency. So there is the concrete risk that in many countries this data could be abused to control the masses, to control the sentiment of the masses, and to destroy any kind of opposition. This is a huge risk, and governments are aware of these risks.
Now, there's another thing also. As we know, large corporations are already using big data, algorithms to control lots of things, to actually suggest to people what they're supposed to do, to create consumption patterns, to actually monitor their movements and their lifestyles and so on and so forth. And we basically letting them do this happily because the entire world is on Instagram and Facebook and the rest of it, and all this information is being gathered. What do you think of the risk in that?
I believe that the risk is concrete. I always say that nothing is for free. So if we are thinking that we are using social networks, instant messaging application, and other technologies for free, we are wrong. Because all the data that these companies behind these services are collecting could be used to control the habits of the people, to control their way to act, to control the relationship between people, and they could be also abused to also control the sentiment of an entire population on specific topics. Let me remind you, for example, what was happening with the Cambridge Analytica. So it was probably one of the biggest privacy scandals that has happened in the last years. And we believe that probably 2016 presidential election in the US were influenced by this kind of operations. Well, we must be aware that the same situation could happen elsewhere. I can tell you that in Europe, we are working on specific privacy, let me say, framework that aims to protect the privacies of individuals, but it's not the same all over the world. Let me analyze, for example, the situation in China. China is employing the application, as you told you before, but they are also using drones to control the quarantine of the people. They are using surveillance cameras. All the data that comes from these technologies could be grouped, could be analyzed using a machine learning system, artificial intelligence, in order to influence the life of the individuals. There is a huge risk.
So where do we go from here? As I said, this is not something that can be disinvented. Obviously, we cannot go back to the pre-digital age. But, and I also said that there are lots of conveniences and there are lots of pluses of this technology also. But while utilizing this for the general public good, how is it that we can try and reduce the dangers latent in this as far as state despotism is concerned?
I always suggest to use technologies only when we really need it. For example, let me speak about the Internet of Things, okay? We are reaching 1 billion of devices that surround us and that we are using without understand the information that they are collecting, who is managing those applications. So the first thing to do is let's use only the technologies when we need this kind of technologies. I really need an oven that could be controlled remotely. I really need my frigidaire that could be controlled, my kitchen that could be controlled remotely. If I don't need these, okay, I have to avoid the use of this kind of technology, because we have to consider that anyway, anytime we use a technologies and we are not able to understand with a great confidence the way this technology is using our data, we are opening a door in our digital kingdoms. Okay, and the digital kingdoms and our real life are overlapped today. So every time we are using a new app on the mobile phone, we must be sure that we need those apps, because potentially this kind of application could open the door to surveillance, to hacking, and any kind of risks for ourselves.
Absolutely, but here's the problem. Today, as you know, there are apps for ordering food, there are apps for registering sort of tickets in a cinema, there are apps for hailing a cab, there are apps for everything under the sun. So how does one determine what app one doesn't need and which one does need?
It depends on single individuals. Single individuals could need of an application or cannot need this application. Well, I believe that it's important the awareness on the risks. So, in my point of view, we need a cultural change, and this kind of cultural change must be pushed by governments. In many states, for example, in Europe, we have many organizations, privacy advocate organizations, and also some parties that are pushing the discussion about the importance of the privacies and are forcing the organization, the companies, the business behind these applications and services to clarify how they use the data of the users. But it's not simple. So I believe that the unique way that we have in order to prevent the risk of exposure of our digital identity and our life is to use only the application, the technologies that we really need. In order to do this, we must be aware. So we need government programs that will explain to the population which is the risks when we are ordering, for example, the food with our mobile application, or when we buy, for example, a ticket of a restaurant using the mobile application. We need
but here's the thing, Paganini, you're absolutely right, but you're talking about a state which is still alive to the idea of individual liberties. And that state actually is prepared to tell its citizens that some of these things are not good for you. But what about states that, let's say, would say, hey, all of you are going to have this app in the phones. Because if you don't have these apps or this particular app, you cannot travel, you cannot pay your taxes, you cannot get your salaries. Now, in that case, an entire population, society will be forced to use that app.
Yeah, you are right. And the only way in this case, so when there is a government that is forcing or is applying a mass surveillance on the population, is to influence the public opinion. So we need the diplomacy that it must work with this government to say, hey, guy, if you continue to apply mass surveillance on your population, I cannot do business to you. Don't forget that today, everything follows the money. So the business probably is the best way to try to force some government to, let me say, use a low level of the surveillance activity. But I fear it's a challenge.
I get your point. But that has its problems, political problems. But thank you so much. That was Pierluigi Paganini, an expert in digital technology, speaking with us from Rome. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the call by Turkish and US presidents for ceasefires in Syria and Libya. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Last Tuesday, Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan spoke with US President Donald Trump. Both leaders stressed the need for ceasefires in Syria and Libya. Their call is in line with what the UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres has already called for. Last Monday, Guterres said, "The fury of the virus illustrates the folly of war. That is why today I'm calling for an immediate global ceasefire in all corners of the world. It is time to put armed conflict on lockdown and focus together on the true fight of our lives." Turkey itself is in partial lockdown. The number of infected people in Turkey has increased to 10,827, while the death toll, unfortunately, has reached 168. The US is also grappling with the spread. 657 people died in a single day on Monday in the US as the death toll jumped to 3,157, which means the US is almost poised to surpass China's grim toll of 3,300 deaths. There's much speculation and analysis about whether the pandemic has or should force states to rethink old categories of geopolitics. The 14th century Black Death didn't, neither did the 1918 Spanish influenza. In fact, many researchers have suggested that the conditions of the war significantly added the spread of Spanish influenza, especially its deadliest second wave. while others have argued that the course of the First World War and the subsequent peace treaty was influenced by the pandemic. Either way, traditional structural constraints of geopolitics proved sturdier than the flu virus. Peace led to what Carr called the 20 Years' Crisis and a Second World War. Geopolitics is a way of trumping all else. So what are we looking at? Let's get to our panel of experts. We are joined by Mathew Bryza, who's a former U.S. ambassador. I'm also joined by Yusuf Erim, who is the Turkey analyst for TRT World. Thank you to both of you. Ambassador Bryza, let me begin with you. There are calls for ceasefire. Obviously, we are looking at something that no one, despite all the talk since 2007, 2008 about such pandemics, no one was really prepared for it. But as I said in my opening, geopolitics still seems to trump everything else. Do you think that's going to happen once this is over, or do you think there's going to be a rethink?
Well, I mean, in terms of the conflict in Libya, yeah, despite the ceasefire that was apparently agreed by all sides in late January, the fighting continued. Turkey has abided by it, by the way. I mean, it isn't letting arms flow in or is not sending arms in anymore in accordance with that agreement, but the fighting's continued. And even after Secretary General Guterres, as you just said, called for a humanitarian truce, the Haftar forces have intensified their attacks on the outskirts of Tripoli. So at the moment, despite the COVID-19 disaster, which has hit Libya, although not to the extent it has the United States or Europe, the war is continuing. And by all visible evidence, it seems like the arms keep coming in. The United Arab Emirates is still supporting the Haftar side. The Russian mercenaries are still there. So despite all the fears about COVID-19, yes, geopolitics are for the now very much trumping the humanitarian response to COVID-19.
That's what I thought. Let me go to Yusuf. So, Erim, what do you think of a rethink? I mean, there are state interests, there are people in Syria. Let's talk about Syria, since Ambassador Bryza has mentioned Libya. There's the Idlib peace. Russia has its own interests. Turkey has its own interests. Bashar al-Assad has its own interests. And in the middle of all this, the people of Syria, frankly, under the conditions, really do not have a voice. So do you think that things will begin to look up given this pandemic, or do you think fighting could again continue?
Well, we have to realize right now that what Syria and Libya are going through is basically the beginning of the first phase of the pandemic. You look at where Turkey was at 2 weeks ago. It announced its first case March 10th. Now, as of yesterday, April 1st, there's 15,000 cases. Same thing with the United States. They went very quickly from 100 cases to over 100,000 cases. So at this current conjecture right now, obviously coronavirus isn't top priority in Libya or Syria, but we can very quickly see the coronavirus turn into an Italy-type scenario for Syria and Libya, or even much, much worse, because obviously the healthcare systems of both countries have been decimated, as hospitals and doctors have been a major target of both Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad and the Libyan warlord Khalifa Haftar. So while currently the coronavirus is not playing into geopolitical decisions, that could change very, very quickly depending on which parties the virus hits hardest when it begins to spread, because the spread of the virus is going to be inevitable. Nobody's immune to it, not the richest countries in the world or the poorest countries in the world. And both Syria and Libya will get their fair share of being hit hard by this virus. If the virus does hit regime areas very, very hard, it can lead to Bashar al-Assad reorganizing his priorities and thinking about how to protect the survival of his regime in areas that are under his control, and putting areas like Idlib, the Euphrates Shield Zone, Afrin on the back burner for another day, a day where he can actually, again, prioritize his priorities in a manner that will meet his needs for that time. But I do think right now Assad is concentrated on Idlib, Haftar is concentrated on Tripoli, but that doesn't mean things can change very, very quickly, as we've seen with many other countries who have other geopolitical aspirations, but are looking inward and more concentrated on protecting their public health.
Okay, now that's a very interesting way of looking at it. Bryza, Yusuf Erim has a very interesting point. Now, while the global supply chains have mostly been disrupted because of the virus, the weapons supply chains in conflict areas seem to be doing pretty okay, unfortunately, I might add. But if this does spread, like for instance in Syria, as Yusuf was saying, there's going to be change of priorities, but change of priorities perhaps also means that those who are opposed to Assad will probably get the space to move in and take advantage of that situation. Do you think that is a possibility?
Syrian society suffers the sort of breakdowns, as we've been seeing, at least in the healthcare side, in the regime-controlled areas, as Yusuf was just describing. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for Assad to continue prosecuting the war. Now, the opposite is true in terms of his opposition and up in Idlib, where those people have suffered so much already. The healthcare system essentially doesn't exist. So you could definitely see a shifting in the ability to carry out the conflict from the Syrian government's side. But I think at the end of the day, Assad knows that this conflict is about his physical survival and about the physical survival of his family and all of his circle, all of his support circle. So I think he's also going to have quite an intense incentive to keep up the fight. The question is, would Syria, under the weight of such a pandemic catastrophe, simply be able to do so? And I think nobody knows the answer to that question.
Absolutely, that's anybody's guess. Thank you so much. That was Mathew, Bryza speaking with us. Yusuf Erim, I have this article, and now let's kind of take the focus away from the virus itself and refocus on the various interests in Syria. Now, this Guardian article by Simon Tisdall, it talks about the Idlib ceasefire, and he says the ceasefire in Idlib is, like many previous Syrian truces, unlikely to hold. It will not stop the suffering of hundreds of thousands of displaced and terrified people who remain cut off from adequate humanitarian relief and medical aid. It will not solve the refugee crisis on Europe's borders, nor will it bring justice to victims of numerous atrocious war crimes. And then he goes on to blame all sides, including Turkey. Give me a sense of whether you would be optimistic with reference to the Idlib ceasefire.
Well, when we look at the problem in Idlib, we have not seen it solved yet. We're just seeing a temporary stop to fighting. Assad is still the aggressor. There's still the presence of HTS in Idlib. And he's right on blaming all sides. I mean, Turkey has not been able to take care of the HTS problem yet, but it's working hard to. It's not easy to disintegrate and destroy a terrorist organization that is entrenched amongst 3 to 4 million civilians. It's a very tough task, and the Turkish military is working very hard at it. And also Russia is at great fault because it hasn't been able to rein in Assad. And as long as these two factors are weighing in Idlib, it's only a temporary solution. But right now, a temporary solution was needed to stop this migration exodus going up north. Now, I don't think the situation has changed. The only solution for Syria is a political solution, regardless of how far away that looks. And this ceasefire right now, it's very important that Turkey's keeping its military in place and keeping Assad honest. And as this, I know you want to take the coronavirus out of the equation right now, but it's hard to talk about the next 2-3 months and not talk about the coronavirus impacting Syria.
That's true. No, I was just being parsimonious about it in terms of looking at the issue saw the coronavirus. But you're absolutely right that one has to factor that in. But thank you so much. That was Yusuf Erim speaking with us on this. I am also joined by Hadi Nasrullah, who is an independent commentator and joins me from London. Mr. Nasrullah, thank you so much. We're talking about the call for ceasefires in Libya and Syria. And my opening was that, despite the virus, we have seen that geopolitics trumps or seems to trump everything. What is your reading of the situation? Do you think, in Libya, the fighting is already started. In Idlib, the ceasefire is still holding. But do you think the virus will have any significant impact on these conflicts in terms of either stopping the fighting or aggravating the situation?
Well, I believe that the virus will definitely have an impact after all, because it's a global pandemic right now, and all governments are involved in trying to either contain it or fight it. Syria is obviously one of those countries, since they discovered the case a few weeks back, and now there are around four confirmed cases in Syria and 2 deaths because of the coronavirus. So countries like the essential countries in Syria, like Russia, Turkey, Syria, Iran, now they're all basically busy fighting the pandemic in their own countries, or trying to find solutions for what's happening in their own borders. So I believe that will affect the fighting process in Idlib, as all countries now are focusing on a ceasefire in Idlib, and it's still holding on until now. So if there was a chance to go towards a fight or towards some political or military engagement in the area, I think now is going to be postponed definitely because of the virus.
Okay, so you basically saying that the next couple of months to 3 months, given the situation of all the states that are interested parties, and also the virus itself in Syria, that the fighting and the violence could actually come down. That would be a very good thing, except that if the virus also begins to spread in Syria, then the Syrian people who have already suffered so much will be suffering yet another problem.
Exactly. That's going to be hard for the Syrian people to deal on both sides. Let's say for the civilians inside Idlib, I don't think they have the military equipment they need to actually combat the virus if it spreads inside Idlib. And for the Syrians inside government-held areas, they have a lack of some medical supplies because of the sanctions that are being enforced on Syria until today.
That's another problem. Yeah, that's another problem. That's all problem that Iran is facing. That was Hadi Nasrullah speaking with us. Thank you so much for your insight. This is all for tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Meanwhile, for latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.